And we're not live. We are not live. The following conversation was recorded privately for the Head On community. The Head On community meets almost daily for conversations on important issues. It's a community of people from all walks of life, from all sides of the ideological spectrum. If you want to join us, check out that link in the description. We'd love to have you.
Ideally, I see that there's some excitement from the audience. I'd love folks to just come and ask you questions kind of directly, just keep this a little more conversational, if that's okay.
Sure.
So to start out, for people who haven't yet read the book, highly encourage everybody to get a copy. I think you also did the audio, like an Audible version.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That was you reading it.
Yes.
That was a great narration. That was also really fun to read. So I certainly encourage everybody. I think I read it at this point about nearly 2 times, maybe either
Oh,
one.
wow. Okay. I'm honored.
It was, just to try to collect my thoughts here. I asked my mother to read the book too.
Wow, thank you.
Well, first of all, she resisted it. She was triggered by the title. Just the title itself triggered her. And I was like, just, make it past. It's okay. And I'm very curious about what the motivations are for writing a book like this right now.
I mean, I was just really been struggling. I guess I've been struggling for a while, but especially since October 7th, after the horror of that day, the day was horrifying, but I felt that the response in the Jewish spaces where I lived was helped me, because the responses were focusing on the humanity of the people who had been killed, of the Israeli Jews who'd been killed, of our people. And I was learning about the names of these people and their family stories and what had happened to them, and we were coming together. And then as the days passed and Israel was killing more and more Palestinians, I felt that the discourse about the death of Palestinians was so radically different, that oftentimes I was in these spaces where Palestinians' death wasn't mentioned at all. Certainly, even if it was mentioned, it was never humanized, in the sense that I was learning the names of people who were being killed, learning who they were. And oftentimes I felt that the discourse, when it acknowledged Palestinian death, essentially was blaming Palestinians for their own death. Well, for either saying, probably not that many people are really dying because they're exaggerating the numbers, or they brought it upon themselves. It's Hamas's fault because they're using them as human shields. And I was hearing this in spaces that are very important parts of my life, around people who I care about. And I felt that there was something wrong with this discourse. I felt like this wasn't their best selves, that was leading to this kind of discourse. And I wanted to try to understand, make sense of the stories that I think were interfering with people's ability to actually take in the horror of what was being done in Gaza.
Some of these stories, I think, so you're referring to, let's say we have like a common maxim among Jews, certainly American Jews, that first they tried to kill us and then we survived, and now let's eat, almost as like an encapsulation of like the meaning of every one of our holidays. You take issue with this representation of the holidays and of Jewish history. Why?
Well, because I think that Jews are human beings, so we can be just like any other group of human beings, we can be victims or victimizers. And I think that Jewish sacred texts actually do describe Jews in these variety of different ways. The book of Esther is a book of which Jews read on the holiday of Purim, is a book about attempted genocide of Jews, but it also ends with a Jewish massacre of their enemies. And so I felt like this, to me, really flattens Jewish history and Jewish identity, and puts Jews, it's as if every enemy, as if the Palestinians are just the reincarnation of the monsters of the Jewish past, which I think is dehumanizing of Palestinians, and also allows us to not confront some of the ways in which the situation in Israel-Palestine is just fundamentally different. When you say this is the largest number of Jews killed since the Holocaust, you're implying that this has something to do with the Holocaust. But to me, the conditions, or that it's a pogrom, the conditions in Israel-Palestine are completely different than the conditions that in which those other examples of kind of violence against Jews took place.
For a lot of pro-Israel Jews and a lot of Israelis, they sort of see this as in some ways like a zero-sum contest, because they see that what Palestinians actually want is their destruction, is their annihilation, is to drive them into the sea.
Yes.
And so they see parallels between this and other forms of anti-Semitism that they had experienced in their past.
Yes.
And therefore, in their mind, it's almost like, I feel like when I speak to Israelis, it's like they're trapped. Like, what can we do? There's nothing that they can do, because if you give an inch, they'll take a mile and they'll try to destroy us even more effectively, and they'll be able to.
Right.
What is it that what are they saying that you're not saying, or what are you saying that they're not saying?
All I would say that there's probably not a day that goes by, or not 2 days that goes by, that I don't have political conversations with Palestinians. I just finished interviewing Marwan Barghouti's son, earlier today. It's a constant series of conversations with me that so I don't want to claim, obviously, I'm limited in my knowledge and perspective like everybody else. But I would just say, and I'm not talking about Palestinian moderates, right? I mean, all the Palestinians I talk to think Zionism is racism. They don't generally support the idea of a Jewish state within any borders. I mean, they might compromise if they had to, but they don't believe that it's legitimate. So those things are true, but my experience overwhelmingly over many years has been that Palestinians want freedom and equality. They don't want the death of Jews. They don't want the expulsion of Jews. They want to be treated as equal human beings. And I think what happens in Jewish discourse, and tell me if you agree or not, is that there's a conflation of the existence of the state and the existence of individual Israeli Jews. So when you say they want to destroy the state, well, in a certain sense, they don't want a state based on Jewish supremacy. I don't think that makes them pathological, right? I wouldn't want to live in a state that didn't treat me equally. But that doesn't mean that you want to kill the Jews that are there. I think most Palestinians will accept and feel very, very happy to be able to live equally alongside Israeli Jews. And I know that seems like pathologically naive to most Jewish Israelis and to many American Jews. But I will say this has been my experience. And the reason that I bring in other historical examples is to try to say that this idea that you can only be safe if you are legally supreme is not unique to Jews and to Israel. But in fact, people tend to be safer when the people along whom they're living with actually are treated equally.
Yeah, I imagine to a lot of Israelis it would sound naive, but probably to most Israelis it would just sound extremely dangerous, right? Like what we're trying to do here is we have a hostile population.
I should say Jewish Israelis, not Israelis, right? Because 20% of Israel's citizens are Palestinians. I don't think it would sound so crazy to them.
Certainly not to them. To the 80% that are to the Jews in Israel, it would sound like, sure, that might be the case. It might be the case that we will be safe in the arms of our Palestinian neighbors. But if it's wrong, we are going to pay a very heavy price. And the history shows what kind of price we pay. Is it worth taking the risk? And one of the things that I think there's like a theme in your book and in your writings about like the analogy with South Africa, and that the whites in South Africa had felt a similar conviction about a similar degree of fear.
Right, about Northern Ireland and white Americans too. Yeah.
What can you say to Jews in Israel who are nevertheless sincere about that fear? And how can we get to a place where we can either experiment with like addressing that fear?
Yeah, I think that the first thing I would say is that I don't think the current situation also has tremendous dangers, right? And I think that when you are denying people their basic human rights, you are imposing a lot of violence on them, right? And I try to argue in my book that violence that Israel imposes on Palestinians also endangers Israeli Jews too, right? I mean, we know that Hamas recruits its fighters from families of people who've been killed, right? So you have a lot of potential people, and I tell in my book the stories of the leader of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, right, who saw his father killed when he was 3, and has been fighting Israel ever since, right? So that, to me, endangers Israeli Jews, unless you think maybe you can get rid of all the Palestinians, and then maybe there won't be a problem. But I also think that one can look at even the example of Palestinian citizens of Israel, Arab Israelis, right? I don't think, I mean, you can tell me if you disagree. I don't think Israeli Jews are as afraid of Palestinian citizens as they are of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, because there are a lot of doctors and nurses and pharmacists, as you know, who are Palestinian citizens. And I think part of the reason that those people are less frightening is that those people, because they have citizenship, even though they're discriminated against, they have some opportunity to build a better life, which means that they're going to be less likely to take up arms. And I think that that, to me, is a basic lesson you see in political science, that when people have a voice in government, they are less likely to take up arms.
I don't remember exactly where the passage is, but where you differentiate between them taking up arms and Jews being under the knife of the Palestinian surgeon. That was a beautifully poetic passage for anybody who's going to get to that. That was very well done. I wanna open it up. I know a couple people have some questions. I want to give people just a snippet from the book so that they can have a sense here. You're talking about how relatively late in life you first encountered Palestinians and had Palestinian friends.
Yes.
And you were initially surprised by the sophistication, quirkiness, sweetness, and normality of the people that you met. And then I felt ashamed of my surprise. It was by encountering Palestinians that I realized the depths of the humanization I had been carrying inside. And that over time you just began to have, I think you encourage people to also like actually speak to Palestinians or read or consume material by Palestinians. Any ideas and examples and tips on how exactly to do that?
Well, I mean, there's lots of great writing out there. I mean, I think one book that really impacted me was an old book, but Edward Said's book, The Question of Palestine, where he really talks about Zionism from the standpoint of its victims, which for me was just a very different way of thinking about what Zionism meant than the way I had been raised. But what I love about Said's writing too is that even as he's a very profound critique of Zionism in Israel, he understands why it was so appealing to so many Jews. He understands why given Jewish history, and especially the history of the 20th century, so many Jews found Zionism to be a refuge and a liberation. So I was very moved by his ability to both critique, but also to kind of put himself in the shoes of Jews. And that's what I wish more Jews could do for Palestinians. You could say, like, and Ehud Barak famously said, if I had grown up in a refugee camp, I would be a terrorist, or something like that. I would join the PLO, right? Like, to me, that's the act of moral imagination that we need more of. And I think the way it becomes easier to do when you read books by people or watch films by people, you think, okay, if I had lived this life, how might I see things differently?
Peter, for the record, we're building a community here and then a social platform to help facilitate conversations between people opposing sides of different ideologies. With that in mind, if anybody has questions for Peter, we got 3 minutes. Maybe you could just quick firing of them away. So Al, if you want to hop on the stage for just a moment. Okay, Al, I think you're here. You're still on mute, though.
Yes, can you hear me? Hi, Peter.
Hi.
I was just going to ask you a question about, are you an anti-Zionist for religious reasons or for more humanitarian reasons? Or is it a combination of both?
I mean, to make things even more complicated, I don't actually define myself as an anti-Zionist. I'm kind of actually would define myself as a cultural Zionist who opposes a Jewish state, but that might sound like a very bizarre formulation. I don't support a Jewish state. I guess for me, I think it's both. I mean, I think that I believe in the principle of equality under the law. I believe that states should give everyone the same legal rights, irrespective of their religion or ethnicity or race. And I also believe that I think there are lots of different ways to interpret Jewish tradition. But for me, I guess the way I think about it at a really childlike level is that human beings are created in the image of God. And so the political expression of that theological principle is that people should be legally equal in the eyes of the state.
You draw a distinction there in the book, and I thought it was a useful one, between like the right to self-determination and some other category of right or expectation, some of which would just be like autonomy. Right. So.
Yeah, I mean, the point I make about self-determination is self-determination only gives you the right to determine yourself, right? Not other people. So you can't say that the Jewish right of self-determination means that Jews have the right to hold millions of Palestinians as non-citizens under military law. And so, yeah, I think if self-determination can often mean a form of cultural autonomy, that you live, let's say Canada, right? You have equality under the law, but in Quebec, they're going to run their schools mostly in French. Right. So, in an equal Israel-Palestine, I think it would be natural that in certain communities, the language of instruction is not going to be exactly the same in, in Tulkarm as it's going to be in Bnei Brak, right? That there's going to be forms of cultural and local autonomy to preserve people's identities, but the principle should be that people are being treated equally under the law.
Peter, I see the hour. Serge, I'm sorry if we missed the chance. Peter, I imagine you have to roll off.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It was just getting closer to Shabbat, and I have a few things I got to get done before the bewitching hour.
No worries. Adar, thank you very much for setting this up, and Peter, thank you for joining us. We probably will tap you on the shoulder to see if you can join us again for more of these conversations.
I'd like that, and thank your mother on my behalf. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter. This was great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Absolutely. All right. Be well. Take care.